Hi, I'm Selena, and welcome to Selena's Musings. Today's musing is a little bit different. It's a bit of a difficult thing to talk about, and I think that's in part by what has inspired today's musing. So if you can tell by the title, what I want to talk about and reflect on today is this idea of whether we should love our enemies, our abusers, and our oppressors. And you may be wondering what kind of inspired this. Well, the thing that really inspired this has been what we saw in the courtroom at the sentencing of Amber Guyger. And there were a couple of things that folks have been talking about that was remarkable at the sentencing. One is what I feel ridiculously short sentence of 10 years for taking someone's life. She was charged with and found guilty of murder. And so 10 years is really, really just, I can't even express in words how disappointed I am about the sentencing, but I'm not surprised. And there's a lot of really great videos that are out there that really break down the sentencing and break down the dynamics of all of that. And I'll include some of them in the description box. But what I want to kind of focus on is this idea of, again, whether we should love our enemies and oppressors and abusers. And that's come up because a lot of folks were outraged by the fact that Amber Guyger received a hug, not only from the brother of Botham Jean, but also by the judge, and also received some comforting in the form of like patting her back and rubbing her hair from the bailiff. And so I want to make one thing abundantly clear. I personally do not judge the family for grieving and coping how they grieve and cope. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, just in general. But for Harriet, I think does a great job of breaking down why she does not criticize his little brother. And when we say little brother, this young man just turned 18. He was still a minor when his brother was killed. He's struggling, and I can begrudge him nothing for coping in the way that works for him. The judge, on the other hand, that was something else. And I think a lot of folks have been thinking, on the one hand, you have some people who are applauding it and saying, oh, this is such a wonderful show of compassion. And you have other people who are frankly disgusted by it and think that it's just another example of folks kind of internalizing and reinforcing things like white supremacy, right? Because you have in this courtroom a judge who's Black, a victim who's Black, family who's Black, the bailiff who's Black, and we're seeing this kind of sympathy levied upon the murderer, who happens to be white, who happens to be a former police officer who was in a role of authority when this all went down. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the details of the case itself because there's a lot of great content out there that already digs into it. But when I ask myself, Selena, should you love your enemies, oppressors, and abusers? I think the answer is not whether you should or not. The question is, may you? I don't think you should or should not. I think it depends, right? I think you may, but you have to be very cautious. And I think one of the reasons why I have a very visceral reaction whenever I hear anything about loving your enemy is because I only really hear that being said to people who are being victimized or people who are vulnerable, right? Like I feel like it's often a tool that can be used to further oppress people. And so that is why I say that if you choose to love your enemies, abusers, and oppressors, you have to proceed with extreme caution. And so the rest of this video, I'm really going to focus on the things, or the guide rails, if you will, that you need to make sure you have in place if you choose to really go there, right? Because again, it's a very, very dangerous, slippery slope. And there's a few reasons for that I will get into. So before I dig into that, though, I want to say that when it comes to me and my choice and how I kind of approach these things, I really think of a pretty famous quote from James Baldwin, which is as follows: we can disagree and still love each other, unless that disagreement is rooted in my oppression and the denial of my humanity and right to exist. Now, I don't know if I got that right word for word, but you get the essence of it. For me, I choose to keep my enemies, oppressors, and abusers well at arm's length. And I do think it's worth mentioning that hate is not the opposite of love. Indifference is the opposite of love. And for me, I'm not going to give my oppressors, abusers, and enemies that kind of energy in either direction. But again, when we look at people, for example, like Botham Jean's brother, for him, forgiveness, finding love in his heart for his enemy was an important thing for his healing, I suppose, right? I mean, that's just from outside looking in. And I think that, my advice to him would be with the same advice that I'm sharing with you all. If you're going to do that, here are the things you need to keep in mind. 1, is it even love that you're extending? And I say that because a lot of times there are trauma responses that look like love. They might even feel like love, but they not love, okay? Let's take, for example, the most kind of extreme, one of the more extreme examples, Stockholm Syndrome. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. Maybe I'll do a future video on this, but I'll have some links below about information that kind of details Stockholm Syndrome more. But basically, this is the phenomenon where people will form a deep bond and attachment of sorts to their captor, to the person or entities that are torturing them, who've taken them captive, that sort of thing, right? And you might say, that sounds like, why would you do that? Well, we've all heard of fight or flight, right? So a lot of times our instinct, if someone is threatening us, is to fight or flight, to run away, right? There's another response, and I'm not talking about freeze. The response I'm talking about is to fawn. What does it mean to fawn? Well, what it means to fawn is to show affection in order to kind of garner endearment, right? So if you fawn over someone, you're showing them love, you're showing them affection, right? And it's a very normal survival instinct if you think about it, right? Like if you're not in a position where you can fight your enemy and you're not in a position where you can run away, then it might make sense that instinctually you might tell yourself like, okay, well, maybe if I'm nice, maybe if I'm really respectful, right? Where do we hear this? Respectability politics. Maybe if I say, yes, sir. Maybe if I say, no, ma'am. Maybe if I keep my head down. Maybe if I wear the right clothes, right? You have to tell yourself that as a means of kind of surviving. But the reality of the situation is that A, that's not love, and B, it's a dangerous game, because people who are psychopaths, people who have narcissistic, sociopathic tendencies will use that against you to keep you trapped in this cycle of trauma and abuse. On a micro level, we see it in relationships. We see it in the form of trauma bonding, where your abuser creates these highs and lows and you become addicted to it. So going back to that first guardrail, you have to ask yourself, is this even love, or is this a trauma response? For me, in that courtroom, what I saw from that judge, that feels like deeply indoctrinated trauma response. That's what it seems like to me. It's something that a lot of folks in the Black community in America have internalized as a survival mechanism. A lot of times we see people in authority and these sorts of things, and it's just been ingrained in us that something doesn't look right here, right? It's like, oh, this is a former officer. She's a nice white lady. Why would she have done this on purpose, right? And even though they found her guilty of murder, they still treated her as though it was not a guilty murder verdict, right? In the end, they treated her as though it was an accident. I think they even used terms like mistake, and it was a really dissonant kind of thing going on, right? So next thing to consider. So let's say that you ruled out it's not a trauma response. It is in fact love. You have to ask yourself, what kind of love are we talking about, right? Because there's different kinds of love. And I'll also include some links below to more information on the different kinds of love. The Greeks have several different definitions. I'm just going to provide a few. One is philia, or brotherly love, right? This kind of love that you feel between your family, between friends, people who you have a bond with. Then there's eros, or romantic love. This is a sort of love that you have between spouses or lovers, right? Then you have agape love, which is divine love. This is the kind of love that for folks who believe in God, that's the kind of love you believe God has for you and the kind of love you have for God. It's also the kind of love that you have for people in a divine sense. So it's kind of like my higher being loves your higher being, or my soul loves your soul. This is the kind of love that we see between people who, for example, don't know each other. When you're helping somebody out who's vulnerable, or you're giving to charity, or that sort of thing. If it's done out of love, that's usually the kind of agape love we're talking about. So agape love can be healthy and healing to extend, even to people who may mean you harm, because agape love does not require any sort of connection or bond or attachment. Brotherly love, romantic love, those do, right? So again, I think it could be healthy if for your healing process, which I think was the case for both of them, John's brother, if for your healing process, you find it healthy to extend some sort of agape love, that could be cool, right? But under no circumstances is it ever wise, in my opinion, to extend brotherly love or romantic love to people who mean you harm. And that's the definition of an enemy, somebody who means you harm, right? And you want to stay out of harm's way, which gets at my next point, which is that it's very dangerous to entertain any of this if you do not first have deep, genuine self-love. That is essential. That is essential, right? If you don't have deep self-love, then you're really not going to be able to have genuine love for anybody else. B, you're not going to be able to protect yourself from people who mean you harm, right? And C, if we really want to talk about brotherly love or philia, if you don't love yourself, you're really not going to love your brother, right? And so you're going to be more prone to allow people that mean you harm to do harm, not only to yourself, but to your community. And I think this is especially important for people from vulnerable communities to keep in mind. You have to have self-love. You have to have that brotherly love. You have to keep yourself and your community intact. And you have to prioritize that above this idea of loving your enemy, right? Because, I mean, self-preservation is key. And again, if you're finding yourself not exercising self-love, but you're extending it to folks that you consider to be your enemy, then it's probably not love. It's a trauma response, right? And I think one of the reasons why folks in the Black community, including myself, were so outraged by that response is because we see that it is rarely to never extended in reverse. I mean, just less than 2 weeks ago, a that's correct, 6-year-old young Black girl had a tantrum at school, which all 6-year-olds are prone to have, right? She happened to have sleep apnea, so she didn't sleep, which made her tantrum even more severe. In the course of her tantrum, she kicked somebody, right? Of course, I'm not advocating for 6-year-olds having temper tantrums and kicking people, but the ridiculousness that was levied against this child is criminal. This 6-year-old was arrested, booked, fingerprinted. 6-year-old, okay? So, and obviously, I mean, if it wasn't obvious to you, this was a little Black child, okay? So for people in the Black community, including myself, when you see 6-year-olds being arrested, we had another young Black man in Florida arrested or charged 10 days in jail for missing jury duty. I mean, we're getting crazy sentences for nothing, even our children. And so then when you see somebody who is found guilty of murder get a 10-year sentence, it makes you angry. And it makes you question, okay, why are we extending such compassion to those who are charged with more responsibility, with authority, right? Amber Guyger went through the police academy, which means that she was supposed to be trained on how to de-escalate, right? Allegedly, anyway. You're supposed to receive training on that from what I understand. So if anybody should be more calm In the situation where you allegedly think someone broke into your house, you would think it would be a trained police officer. And yet, no, right? And yet, no. But we're finding folks pouring out all this compassion to her. And it's not that compassion is a problem, but compassion that is reserved for only certain people is a very much a problem. And compassion without full accountability is an extreme problem. And in this case, she was not held fully accountable. And I think that is the biggest problem, right? So to recap, can you or should you love your enemies, abusers, or oppressors? You can if you exercise caution. And the caution should include, one, making sure that it's love that you're talking about and it's not just a trauma response. Two, making sure that you are exercising the right kind of love, which is agape or divine love. You got to leave all that other kind of love alone, because otherwise you're setting yourself up for a big L. And then three, you need to make sure that you first are coming from deep, genuine self-love that extends to your brother, to your community, and to those who are most vulnerable. So I know this was a long video. It was probably very, very passionate, but I think you can hopefully understand why such a subject really does merit us digging deeper. Again, I'm leaving a lot of resources in the links, in the box down below in the description box. If you have comments, I really encourage you to add them to the comment section. I know there's a lot of feelings going on around the subject right now. I'd love to hear what you think. Remember, you are my muses. You inspire me to share my thoughts and reflections. So thank you.